Welcome back to the Library Wonder. Today, we're having another author's spotlight on an author who has quite the love for diesel punk dystopias. He is Vishardrsh, aka Vishardrsh, aka I still don't know how to pronounce his name, and the interview didn't help. We'll be reading a number of his stories, then afterwards we will have an interview with the author. So, without further ado, let's crack open this first book. It's covered in dust. All the dust of yesterday. The gauge on my Ector tank reads 3 hours, 9 minutes. Then, I will die. I adjust the straps and spit into the dust and withered grass, the feeder needles in my arms shifting as I walk. This place was a pasture, once. I can see the farmhouse, 4 stone walls open to the sky, the thatched roof reduced to ash. Around me are the scattered piles of sinew and skin that may have been cows. And they look more like dead bushes. The flesh withered to dust, the hide reduced to paper-thin strips of wrinkled nothing, the bones shells held together by the still, dead air. I kick one as I pass. My foot passes through the spine, snapping it like a blade of grass and coursing through the rest of the blackened mass, back into the tired rhythm of my gait. Useless, I think. Normally, I'd look through them for sinews strong enough to use, but the ones I scavenged before turned brittle and snapped until all that was left was more dust. And besides, I didn't have time. I need Ector. The farmhouse is empty. In a corner, there is a larger pile of ragged blackened remains than can come from just one person. Buttons shining in the darker charcoal gray, I've come to know, means corpse. Maybe they died in each other's arms. 2 people, a family. I don't have time to care. I walk past them, grabbing the folk ward against the evil eye off the hook on the back of the door. My gauntlet clenches, and it crumples to dust. The collector in the palm siphoning the aetherious Ector, and a pipe pumping it into my tank. I check the gauge. 3 minutes. That's all it gave. I keep moving into a bedroom. One has a little sleep charm above a folk's wood cot. It is empty. The charm gives 8 minutes. Despite everything I've seen, I wonder about the cot. Maybe the child was too young to leave such residue. Maybe it died with its family. I think of the little pile of ash in an alley in the last town I passed through, before I stripped that place of everything that could hold Ector. At least this one didn't die alone. I check the tank. 3 hours, 13 minutes. It has been 7 minutes since I last checked. I need to keep moving. This house holds nothing more for me. 3 miles down the road, and I feel the Ector sniffer on my shoulder start fluttering. I squint at the tiny device, the delicate brass pedals half closed and vibrating, as the articulated arm points the bud somewhere before me to my left. Ector. And this far from town? Potentially, a lot of it. I gently shut the bud of the sniffer with my fingertips, with a click of delicate clockwork. No use wasting Ector powering it. I know where to go now. Soon enough, even I can smell it. Ector. A buzz in the hind brain. Life force. Magic. Aether. Viz. It doesn't matter what I call it. It was everywhere. Ubiquitous, animating, extracted, examined, transferred, channeled, quantified, and utilized, and now it is gone. I meet another dirt path, follow it down a hill as it grows muddy, my hurried steps splashing spots of mud onto my clothing, all inorganic material, of course, rough alchemical fibers meant for sacking. And I only slow when my foot slides and I almost fall, the weight of my tank shifting and almost unbalancing me. I right myself and click the sniffer. The flower opening immediately, and the petals fluttering, hummingbird fast, ambient Ector spinning the clockwork so fast it purrs. I go to click it closed again, but the petals spasm against my fingers so hard I fear I might break it. I have never seen one do that, not even at the reservoir at Eden Haven. This much Ector. Here, now. Impossible. But I can smell it, and it's only getting stronger. I reach flat ground, pass into a high street boxed by old stone walls, a singular iron gallows standing sentry with an ash-black stain at the base and around the inside of the noose. The sniffer makes a high-pitched whining noise, and I give in and grasp it, forcing it closed. It makes a grinding noise as it pushes against my fingers and then goes silent. I hope I have not broken it. I only have one. I pass through the town and then walk left, my feet carrying themselves forward on impulse. There, standing alone in a field, is a small stone hut. Faintly, like a heat haze, I see tendrils of Ector rising from its narrow windows. I know I must go in, though I know not why. Something is in my head. I consider fighting it. I do not. Survival is not the victory it once was. The hut is small and empty, but for the remains of some tools, but I know what to do. I reach down, place my gauntlet palm against the floor. A complex thalmic sigil appears, glowing in wheeling lines like a mesh of gears. I know where to place my fingers and do not question why. They spin, and a circular section sinks in and slides to the side, revealing a ladder leading down into darkness. A wave of concentrated Ector hits me, rising from below, leaking out from something. I go down. The passages below are built strong, brass ribbed under smooth stone that echoes as I walk. The tunnel slopes down and the Ector pulses out, swirling around me and through me. My heart beats fast and I fumble, jittering for my rebreather, hoping that it can cope with concentrated magic when it can barely keep the dust out of my lungs on windy days. I feel my pulse slow. Not enough. For the first time in a long time, I close the valves from the tank to the lines in my arm. I breathe in, slowly. And then I continue on. At the end of the tunnel, I see something. Light. The deep, trickle, dark blue of Vis. I walk closer. The Ector so intense I can feel it. I open the valve in my gauntlet, watching Ector being drawn from the air itself, the gauge on my back tank notching up faster and faster as I get close. 12 hours, a day, 2 days, 4, a week, a month. I clamp the valve shut, run Ector into the offensive discharger, and clamp the gauntlet into a fist, fingers locking into place. I feel the Ector push through me in a thrumming rhythm that grows stronger as I walk, until it pounds like a pulse. And then I reach the end of the tunnel. I reach out tentatively, graze a bronze support. A discharge of energy flicks out and stings me, and I step back. Ector pools around my feet like a low mist, as I have only seen it behave in a lab. This much power, this much Ector. Impossible. Impossible. The light silhouettes a heavy door standing ajar. I step through. It is hard to describe what I see. I was not aware that such a place could exist. It is huge, filigree and concrete on the walls, a walkway running around the rim of a huge, deep pit once lit by searing floodlights, though now only the glow of Ector illuminates this place in flat, shadowless light. Huge pipes thrum as they pump the violent purple of Ector to storage who knows where, those that have not fallen into disrepair, hanging empty and jagged-ended. And in this basin, knees worn bloody against the floor, shackles and chains rubbing their joints raw, trapped, kneeling upright, head sunk over, is God. And she is like me, dying slowly. Ector pours out of wounds torn open as if from within, as if whatever force broke the world opened her up to extract her motive force. Huge pipes hung loose around her, some still connected, still pulsing as they extract Viz. I look at the tubes in my own arms, the needles that push Viz into me. Dramatic irony, I suppose. Her eyes are closed, lips tight. Pained? Not quite. But there is awareness there. A comfortless tiredness. I take a step closer to the guardrail, rest my hand on it, opening the gauntlet back up. It clangs, quiet in this huge vacuous space. One eye cracks open and looks at me sidelong, gummed with sleep. She doesn't speak, but I understand. How long did they know that her abuse would end like this, with everything falling apart for a few decades of cheap power? I vault the railing and drop, my gauntlet scraping across the wall to slow my fall. I land with a heavy thud, tired legs just about taking the impact. The basin is huge, and it takes me a while to reach her. Then, I start on the glyph. It is massive, working all the way around her colossal form. I barely recognize most of what I etch in glowing energy, sigils that only bear faint resemblance to the ones I know, but many I do. Release, deconstruct. Hours and hours and hours I crawl on the floor, until my knees are as bloody and torn as hers, but I do not tire. Many would have fought and died to have what I have. The blessing of a god. But it won't matter soon. Line after curving line and detail after intricate detail, the work goes on beyond my ability to count the hours. But it is no easy task to kill a god. And then it is done, and she opens both her eyes, looks at me, and I look back. I reflect that she is beautiful, even gaunt as she is, racked with tears spurting dark Ector. She bids me sit, and I do at last, not realizing just how tired I am. I pull the needles out of my arms, feeling the euphoric stinging tug in my veins. I will not need them soon. I will not need anything soon. She lets me sit for a while. She doesn't want this to end either. Then she breathes out, a slow, shuddering breath. I understand. There can be another chance, but not for us. All the dice must be re-rolled, seeds thrown to the wind. The tree ablaze to provide an updraft, ending a broken reality to start another. Then she blinks a long, slow blink, and a singular teardrop falls from her left eye. It hits the ground between her knees, a little jolt of Viz running into the activator glyph I have drawn there. and it ignites. Glowing, pure, blinding, feverish white, the symbols rising and flipping and connecting, and then they turn on her. I struggle to my feet. I want to be standing at the end of time. And I am, when she explodes, and for the smallest measure of time, chunks of godflesh flying outwards are silhouetted black against the light. And then there is nothing for gods, Ector, space, time, bird song on cold mornings, pain, awkward smiles across the room, thermal rolls, and stars, and tears, and gears, and gauntlets, and greed or me to exist in. And then it all starts again. A world ravaged by greed. Poor place. The next entry we have is a poem. A poem about foxes. Elegy for the roadkill foxes. I collected your sightings, like chestnuts palmed at the park. Smooth, warm spheroids, made alien in the expanse of my black mitted hand. 1, 2, 3 noted, and forgotten until the next time would come that I saw foxes dead in the road. One that sprawled by the crossing would jerk as cars churned past, a puppet tugged by fishhooks, with engine breeze rustling your fur. Not yet matted, though your stomach birthed entrails onto the tarmac. It was always from a distance, or else a glimpse from a car window, a split second of intimacy from which to grieve. And then gone, a road motorway. The graceful, tight-wound violence of your gait, now preserved in the way you decay, slowly dissolving to black gunk and tufts of departing fur, creeping, predatory, malignant, towards nothingness as if you could hunt death, scavenge scraps of remembrance from the overflowed tip of this city. And the next day you were gone, thrown in a skip to rejoin your ersatz food chain from the bottom up. Those poor, poor foxes. Well, the next poem we have is about London. And it smells of it too. Londoner. My mother raised me on the rail scream of the underground and the long walk through London town to see the bright lights and smell hot fats on the bridge which swayed over the pulsing Thames, which birthed this place in steel and blood and stolen sweat, the sugar dripping in by the cool sweet kiss of an iron and timber and hempen catheter and other things which were not ours to claim. My mother showed me arts of a land of green pastures and white sheep and honeyed skies, while out the Tate's height, small windows, the sky, rumbling like traffic that ran below and was grey like the city and burned when the sun died in the east and mocked the neon glow. Over those hunched and ragged and cold and lost without a home to crawl into, to hide from my city of mounted statues, of nameless dead men charging through the riddled, rotting, calcified corpse that is old London town. And I call myself Londoner, not because I love this place, or am proud of surviving it, or the way I cross through the holes and crevices of this 10-faced god body of countless generations of othered. But because this city is in my flesh and in my heart, and the people numb, cold and distant and dangerous, like creatures or predators or immune cells fighting amongst themselves, are as I am, and it is in my lungs and my blood, the microplastics and CO2 in my meat, tainting me here now, however far, however long apart. Londoner, Londoner, Londoner. Well, that poem certainly does inflict the memories of my time in London to me. Hopefully, it's done the same or allowed you to imagine it yourself. The next work we have is a story about echoes and the desert. Echoes and the desert. The town on the edge of the desert is a quiet place, worn and tattered like the birds that take flight at my arrival. Greasy, black-feathered, and lethargic, they fly downwind, away from the sands that pile against the eastern wall. The man who sells me canteens and dried strips of meat from a lean-to warns me of the desert with practiced apathy. The days burn and the nights freeze. Your canteens will not last you as long as you think, and I know the risks, I interject. I have had long enough to prepare. He looks me up and down, seeing the wear on my clothes, the calluses on my hands at the counter, maybe the way my eyes harden. Be wary of the echoes, he says, resigned, dragging my coins off the counter into his palm. Not all of them die quickly. I leave the next day, mountless. The only animals that will come, even this close to the desert, are the birds I saw, scavengers living off the scraps the town leaves. The desert is cold that morning, as the rough dirt transitions unnaturally to sand. As the light rises, the edge of the dunes glow bluish, the sunlight twisted and refracted. Soon afterwards, I start to see echoes rippling through the air in fragments of lost voice. I let them drift past me. I am not here for them. The first day and the first night are the hardest, but I adapt. I have come too far not to. The echoes cluster, numb, ripple-edged and tinny. Screams, broken scraps of curses and pleads into my ears as I try to sleep. But by morning they are gone, and I wonder what it was they echoed. A treasured conversation lost to an aging mind? A quiet corner with forgotten significance? And the second day I see the first of the echoes I was warned of. It shudders, reverberating within itself, shivering tendrils flitting out and spearing the echoes drifting past, arming itself against fading away. I stay still long after it disappears over a dune. On the fifth day, I find what I am looking for. This far into the desert, the sun glows blue, and the dunes on the horizon shift back and forth, back and forth. My footprints subside inwards behind me, the desert echoing my steps in reverse. This place is the terminus, the death of things that repeat, the place at the tapering of echoes. Before me, the dunes lose form, dissolving into chaos. Any further, and the space around me will fall apart and shatter, and shatter, and stop. I can go no further. This has to be far enough. I picture your face and pull on the space around me, feeling alien geometry and abstracted fear that is not mine. Then I pull on the space within me, finding something equally strange. A cold burning sensation runs through me, and I stumble and fall, but I do not stop. I do not stop. I reach deeper into the space before me, the breaking and reforming of rules and the sharp-edged space tearing at my overreaching mind. I feel the echoes rushing past, pulled in to be torn apart and stripped of meaning as I am pulled in with them. But I reach deeper, and there, fragmented, broken, I find you. Not yet gone, but far past returning. I pull on the space within me, feeling my body torn apart behind me like the tearing of a letter from a lover. I pull you together, see the idea of eyes, and the idea of a gaze. I'm sorry, I say, feeling myself slip away, the long rehearsed lines I ran smooth in my mind useless and meaningless. I never said goodbye. You mouth something to me, an expression of understanding, of forgiveness. I cannot tell. As I fall apart with you, I wonder if I ever meant to leave this desert, if I ever meant to honor the wish you gave me. That night, when you knew for the first time that you would not see another spring, pleading that I would keep on living after you were gone. I do not have time to find peace in my repentance before I fade away. The echoes in my mind tapering to white noise. My last thought is of your face under a yellow sun. But I do not taper away. I tear myself away from that place, my body raw and battered and broken. I scramble over the dune and tumble down the other side and get up, stumbling and weak, but alive, and I do not stop. And that night, as I watch the blue-tinged sun touch the dunes, I see the echo of a sunrise on another horizon. I am happy that, for once, we have had a nice end to it all. The next story we have is part of a series, a canon of sorts. It's called A Hard Drive with the words, "A Story," scratched into the case. The last and only thing he had forgotten was how to dream. He was not quite sure when he had stopped. Sleep had become scarcer and scarcer, and he'd never logged his dreams. Sleep times were noted by the system, of course, and if he wanted, he could calculate a time frame to the second, look through the data, and find a probable cause. But he chose not to. In his mind, the dreams had turned off like a light going out when the first hard drives had been plugged in. He knew, logically, that that wasn't true. But memories could be strange like that sometimes. It blended and warped and twisted, almost liquid. That was the great irony of the hard drives, he supposed. Freezing the memories hard and immutable. Raindrops frozen and collated. The hard drives, he sighed silently. At first, they had been nothing more than glorified notebooks, matching the tens of thousands of names to faces alongside snitches of sensation. But time wore on, and it wore on him. So many names, so much to remember, and so many mistakes. So he started moving older memories over too. Those that lost him sleep at night. The faces of the dissonance he had dealt with years ago, in the first days. But they still appeared in his dreams. Faceless, silent, judging, so he stored their names too, not forgetting and not denying. just storing them elsewhere. And his mind had been a little quieter, but not silent, so he moved more across, sending them down into the ever-growing towers of hard storage, those who he had not been able to save, those who he had chosen not to. Then, one by one, as they winked out, the names of those he had worked beside, stripping their knowledge from their voices and storing it separately in 4 hard drives, 1 for the data and 3 for backups. The acts of kindness, the little irritations, the time given, and the anger and the pain of their loss was consigned to rest, compressed on an untended drive with memories of abandoned propaganda projects. By this point, his sleep had become a machine-moderated numbness, but the dreams still persisted. Regret and nostalgia and fear. So he buried more. The name of his childhood sweetheart, and the names of his parents, and the feelings of his first heartbreak, and his second, and his third, and the warm wind of a summer's day with forgotten significance. Down into the towers they went, silent in the discs, silent in his mind, numbness in his dying body. It was then that he forgot how to dream. He closed his eyes, quiet, listening to the blink and whir of the drives. There was one memory he had kept for times like this, when he doubted, when he feared, to remind himself that there was no space for doubt, and that fear was a tool, and that there was no choice. Purposeful, he reached into the terminal. Somewhere in the stacks, a drive spun into life with a blink and a whir. There was a second's delay. Then the response came back. Hard storage memory group 16.501970331. Accessed. He smiled mouthlessly and thumbed through it like a book, with the edges of the pages worn soft and safe. He saw his past self reach out to the keyboard in front of him, with shaking hands, steel bracing arching over the backs and riveted to his frail bones. He felt again the tubes running into his chest flex as he leaned towards the terminal screen, motors whirring to support his spine. He felt the gloss of the keyboard through papery fingertips. It always shocked him how weak he had been, how frail. He couldn't see his body now. He frowned. No. He neatly cut the memory of the thought out and sent it down into the stacks. In the past, he saw himself enter commands, hit enter, and prepare to speak. Setting down their story while they still had a tongue. A story and a manifesto. And a defeat. No, he sent that thought down. Inorganic audio recording. Voices detected. Self. File name. A story. We called it Day 0. The oceans flash froze and the winds stopped. Those who had denied the coming apocalypse were not granted the mercy of a swift death. Take a walk through the cities and you can still see them, preserved in ice by the cold snap. Look close enough and you can see the tears frozen on their faces. There are stories in those corpses. Stories of stupidity and cowardice and fear and sometimes just plain bad luck. The last time I saw those bodies, factory winds had begun wearing them down, like the statues I saw as a child in a museum. Worn, almost featureless but human nonetheless, I remember missing limbs and snapped noses and eye sockets worn to hollow dents, but I cannot tell which is statue and which is corpse. There is a kind of beauty in that lost world, frozen and preserved in the ice, wearing down bit by bit until it is, at last, unrecognizable. It is dead, too dead to rot, but beautiful nonetheless. I suppose there is always something beautiful about the horrifying. I remember I cried standing on the steps of that bunker as the sun blinked out, and I saw my shadow cast long and stark in the light of the torches beckoning me down. Not from fear or sadness, but from awe. Of being infinitely small in a vast blind universe, a universe that had snapped out our sun and sent us drifting off into the dark. But we would not die. Oh no. Forgive me. There were things. When we knew the end was coming, we had a few choices. We could accept it, die quietly and peacefully, and let our spark go out. Or we could gutter on. We could burn whatever we had and survive, and maybe one day we would find a new sun. That was my idea. They had proposed ships going off into the dark, but we all knew that was a fantasy. We could barely get into orbit, let alone cross interstellar space with a living human crew. So I suggested something. I was an engineer then. Maybe even a good one. And it was insane, but possible. In theory. I wanted to turn the planet into a ship. The plan was relatively simple. First, we needed to survive. Our most immediate plans were oxygen and heat. Oxygen would not be so much of a problem. Filter augments would allow us to keep breathing residual oxygen in the atmosphere for hundreds of years before we would have to procure more. Heat was more difficult. Our cities were not designed for air-freezing temperatures, even the ones in the far north. We would need new cities, ones that could stay warm as efficiently as possible. Indefinitely. Underground, as deep as we could go. At first, we built only one. In theory, it could support a population of around 500,000 people. When the sun vanished, that was the only refuge. I still remember how we chose those who would survive. There would be no second chances. Those who had fallen through the cracks. Those who had slipped. Once. Those who spoke too freely. Those who were too smart. Those who might have been dangerous. Chances we could not afford to give. We distributed suicide pills, of course, but I wonder how many took them. How many died to the stinging kiss of the ice. I prefer to count those who survived, whatever that means. The next stage of the plan was the simplest. Expand, get shipyards into orbit, send mining ships ahead to the Oort cloud, set up orbital railguns to protect the planet when it passes through the cloud. The mining ships were important. For the plan to work, we would need a lot of matter. The moon could provide some, but not enough. Not enough for the ring. We could scavenge some, of course, but again, that would not be enough. What we were building, I suppose I should explain. Not that I plan on forgetting. Better to back everything up. The ring will be an orbital megastructure which we will use to rotate the planet, turning the planet's magnetic core itself, to first cancel the planet's rotation, then point it towards the nearest star. A geologically slow process, but then again, we have time to kill. One day we'll have the ring. Here and now, we barely have orbital shipyards, but progress is being made. Slowly. Time and decay are not the problem. We can wear down our factories and build more. We can replace cities. We can weather asteroid impacts and radiation and the toxic atmosphere and the anomalies. But the problem is people. People are unpredictable. Once we held that before us like a flag, the beauty of the variation of the human experience, or some such, but 1,000 conflicting voices, 1,000 voices that are afraid, are hard to control. And fear of the void is impartial. We cannot blame the void. On the other hand, the system that keeps you alive, that is much easier to understand and much easier to blame. That fear needs to be turned elsewhere, inwards, to each other, to make the system strong. A machine that runs steadily must run slowly, and we must run steadily. So we rust the gears and grease the bearings with scabs and soot, because this machine must run at all costs, and it must run for millennia. To create a society that can survive unchanged, we need inefficiency. We need fear. Fear of each other. To survive, I had to foster that fear. And fear became hatred, and that became conflict. Small, easily manageable conflict over unimportant things. The rights to an asteroid. Territory on the icy wastes. And here and there we lose an Ice Walker city, a mining ship, a factory, a life. But this system can run for eternity. Human discontent is kept focused away from the system and away from me. As a useful side effect, it also effectively prevents anyone from becoming too old. Maybe, in the old world, they would have called this an act of inhumanity, of playing God. And perhaps it is, but it is also necessary. This is survival. I saw 2 roads, peacefully drifting off into the dark and keeping our fire lit. So I created a bonfire in the vacuum. Maybe we are the last light of life in the universe. I cannot allow that to go out. A universe with nobody to see it would be as good as no universe at all. But maybe I am just an old man who is afraid of the dark. Computer, end recording. End of recording. He sat quiet in the twilight of blinking lights and inert memory. How naive he had been, even then. Slowly, he reached out to the console and brought up a view of the sky outside. The feed was grainy and crackled with interference, but above the smog-black clouds, a line was visible, bisecting the sky. The ring, turning above it all as the planet careered into the nullscape of space, turning for generations with his liar's promise of progress and another sun, perpetually under construction, perpetually incomplete, grinding everything below it to dust, like the millstone of time. The iron band that held them together and kept them from the stars. What an interesting way to live, with your mind stuck in machines, and dreams left for good. The next work is also from this world. It's called Hardened Mechanisms. Okay, now, get in now! The wind whipped across the permafrost of the dead land between Larber and Unescency. A rolling of shoulders, a sideways look at Jarden. Just a little longer. Camille tapped the radar frenetically. It's coming! Below the ridge the rails ran, horizon to horizon, like a diving line into the smog. Jarden glowered. Get in the mech, you fuckwit! He flexed his fingers, admired them with mock nonchalance. I did to get one out because I got in too soon. An anxious groan. That train'll be here any second now. Enmiat threw back his head and laughed. Ha! Quit your whining, you little meatbag. Jardin grabbed him by the shoulder and pushed him towards the huge shape crouched behind the ridge, but Emniat shrugged her off. Not yet, he said, pushing back. Any fucking second now, Camille forced out tightly, shaking the radar readout at Enmiat to enlist the lumbering augmentee with the same anxiety he felt. Enmiat took the time to give both train jackers a look of consternation. All right then, he said, the faint scream of the train pressing the sound barrier carrying to them from the horizon. Then he made for the mech, the other two cursing and scrambling to join him as he dived under the rotund armor-plated bulk of the hexapedal walker, reaching a hand to the port where nerve wire formed the first connection, wheeling the arms to descend and pull him up into the tight embrace of the cockpit, fitted rubber pressing tight against augments as they clamped down with the familiar pressure. The senses of the tardigrade-shaped mech coming online as his own were shut off. The train was coming. He raised his bulk and made for the ridge, rolling the stubby ball-mounted sensor-riddled railgun of Rebenka's head, as if working a crick out of his neck. The others scrambling to connect their harness lines as he readied to pounce. The train was coming. Fast. The air shuddering as if in anticipation of its speed. You good? Jardin asked, and Enmiat grinned. Let's take this bitch, he growled, his voice muffled by rubber and steel. We'll all be eating well till the sun comes back. And then the train was close enough to see, and Enmiat jumped, the polymuscle of Rebenka's leg beneath the angular armor plating tensing and burning like flesh as they strained, and jumped down to the space where the train would be. And then it was below them in a flash, a long, thin black blur of motion in the grainy dark as Enmiat fell. Too slow? Too late? But his feet impacted the metal and he slid as he clung, and the whirring drill bits of 6 palms spat out and scraped lines in the metal and dug in through the armor, and anchored him, before the machine rage of the train opened up like a crevasse, and gunfire joined the scream of the train's tearing of the air. Turret spewed steel and his front and rear shuddered with impacts as he hunched and punched hole after hole into the roof of the carriage, and wedged the thick digits of his feet into the crack, forcing a gap with a screech of metal, as he disregarded the burn of pulley muscle and the jackers climbed through and in, as he kept cutting and pulling until the gap was wide enough for him to scrape through, rounds tickling his back legs. This carriage was decked with rows of shelving, which he forced aside as he made for the engine. Control the engine, control the train. They had until it got within range of Unesence's artillery grid, and the threat of drop pods. 6 minutes, yelled Camille, rifle raised as they made for the door to the next carriage. Enmiat shouldered his way through the shelves, their contents falling to the floor as they sprung free of their clasps. Camille was already frantically fiddling with the door's port, hands splayed out into a fibrous tangle of thread-like manipulators. Enmiat didn't slow, rearing onto his 4 hind legs and pushing at the door. It bunged but stuck, and he wedged 2 more of his limbs into the gap, the others hurrying through. Then the door behind him hissed open, and gunfire pettered his back. He turned his head and spewed a burst back, the train's guards ducking back behind cover. Inside Rebenka, he gritted his teeth in brutal assessment as he turned sideways to squeeze through the gap. They would not be a concern. His back legs dragged the mangled door shut. The next door opened with a hiss and Camille's cry of joy. Jardin screaming at him to, "Hurry, you big fuck!" And for once Enmiat listened, scrambling to get through the carriage, pushing his body to the limits. 4.5 minutes! There were guards in the next room. The other train jackers hunched against the wall, but Enmiat didn't slow, letting the railgun tear. Rebenka had no voice, but actions spoke loud here. They had not expected this. They had not expected him inside the train. One lunged for him as he passed through the door, a bomb clutched in her arms. He swatted her aside, feeling his blow in the snapping of her brittle little limbs a split second before the sharp, rough warmth of the blast rocked him on his feet. There was not enough cover in the carriage. They tried to hide behind the crates that lined the walls of this room, but his rounds ripped through them, bowl-mounted railguns snapping to pick off a soldier bringing to bear an RPG, sending them spinning as a chunk of their steel body tore free and the rocket exploded on the roof in the pale shockwave. 3 minutes, 2 more carriages! Camille ran ahead, ducking as a surviving guard fired from a corner of the carriage, returning fire and cutting their resistance off. Enmiat reached the door just as it slid open, and was greeted by a taser to the face. A split second's pure electric pain, and then he caught the huge prod and snapped it, as the static cleared, seeing the bipedal mech that greeted him, dancing back. All white ceramite and curved limbs, pulling from their back an oversized rifle that they brought to bear, as his own argument whirred and fired. Their organically bulbous armor sparking and chipping. He didn't slow. It looked like they had expected a mech on the train, but they had not expected him. The ceramite mech snapped out shot after shot at his joints while he kept the railgun blasting, keeping moving towards the last carriage, but Ceramite knew what he was doing. If they wanted to stop him opening the door, they would have to stand in his way. 2 minutes! Ceramite fired at the door port and dived, crouching between him and the floor, firing at point blank until the last slow half second, where they cast the gun aside and met Enmiat's lunge with a dive, ducking into his guard and stabbing straight at his underbelly with a half-meter knife that suddenly blazed red with thalmic glyphs. The blade deformed even as it cut through his armor and into the cockpit, tickling his chest cavity with cauterizing heat before he caught it in his middle arms and tore it out. Ceramite dancing away with the force of his throw and slipping from his grip on their arm even as he jammed his front paws into the door and began straining and punching out with a rear limb as Ceramite tried to go for his back. This door was thicker. The motor was stronger. 1 fucking minute! Screamed Camille hysterically from around the door of the last carriage. Ceramite turned their head towards them. Fuck! They dived for their rifle at exactly the same moment as Enmiat lunged for them. He caught them by their back leg and they slammed into the floor with rib-crushing force, their palm meeting the discarded rifle as he dragged them back, watching as they tightened their finger on the trigger and aimed without sights. Camille's head came apart, in a flash and a snap. The drill bits went through the back of Ceramite's head and torso. They stilled. Less than a minute, he lumbered back to the door, injured limbs bearing his weight unevenly, and began tearing again, his body scraping as he pushed through the too narrow crack carelessly and onto the other side, firing blindly into the floor where his infrared told him there was heat. The engine shuddered and shattered with a hissing and grinding of broken cylinders, but the train did not slow, momentum careening them into artillery range. Jardin sprinted past him, dispatching the pistol-armed driver with 3 wild shots and diving past them into the control cabin, shots sounding from inside. He heard Jardin swear. Then he lurched and wildly slid forwards as the train braked with a bellow of metal under friction that transgressed sound and became a physical force that seemed not to diminish. Too slow? He slammed into the wall and braced in the dents his paws made. The screeching shuddered down a decibel. 0 minutes, 0 seconds. No time for thoughts. Jardin appeared in the doorway. "The containers!" she yelled. "Railgun 'em, and we go!" The 2 shipping containers in the engine's storage room stood dark and monolithic in the white neon twilight. In Rebenka, his hearing was razor sharp, and there should not have been the sounds of movement within the cargo they had been hired to break. 0 minutes. In his pilot fugue haze, he lumbered to the door of the container and delicately lifted the viewing hatch open. A row of suspension chambers, each containing a small pallid form lit by soft blue light, each cowering as far as their injection lines would allow. A 3-pronged symbol tattooed into each of their stomachs and foreheads. Uteri. The cockpit opened and he half descended, still wired to Rebecca. "These are fucking viables," he spat. "You sent us on a murder mission." "And if we don't do the job and get out, it'll be suicide," she screamed. "Move your fucking ass, Enmiat. Get that gun whirring. Now! Now! Fucking now!" The railgun snapped onto her. "I ain't touching him, and I ain't leaving him here," Enmiat growled. "They're squishies," Jordan pleaded, gesturing frantically at the containers. "They won't last 10 seconds outside, and we can't hold the containers before necessity drops on us like a breeze block on a rat."
I won't leave him.
I promised M2 Rafich that the Unis wouldn't get that shipment. We don't have a choice, Emniat. The arms pulled him back into the cockpit.
How much?
He rasped as the hatch shut on his face. Enough, she said, voice thinned by regret. They said they could cure me. Camille died for this, he thought. Camille died for this. The wind whipped across the permafrost of the dead land between Larber and Unescency as they crawled out of the train and into the smog. 2 minutes later, the drop pods landed and shock troops reclaimed the train. The corpses were identified and marked with their manner of death for documentation, final rites, and disposal. But the 2 train jackers had already made their way into the undercroft, one limping as his middle limb clutched a singular suspension chamber to his chest in the subterranean dark. The ring turned above, oblivious. Hopefully, Enmiat is able to forgive or forget and live a better life. If you wish to see more about them, I would recommend reading the Ocular Haze series. But we should move on to the last and final work before our interview. It looks like the cover's made of salt air worn chitin. Let's begin. A disease of the flesh. Today we buried Mikhail in the sea. There was not enough space on the stern for us all, but it didn't matter. The passengers stayed below. Our little funeral party all knew why. It wasn't the cold. Even under the tarp that wrapped him in, we were still afraid. We'd had to draw lots on who would have to touch him to wrap the body. The captain removed his cap and bowed his head, staring at a point just to the left of the body.
I didn't know Mikhail, he said bluntly. None of us did. He came to us with no family left, and now he is gone to God too. Mikhail faced his final challenge with grace and dignity. We owe him respect for that.
Liar, I thought. Mikhail had been taciturn to the point of rudeness, and had hidden his symptoms for as long as he could, feigning a fever. It was only when we caught him trying to tie a bandage around the feelers poking holes through his temple that we'd found out. It had taken 3 shots to kill him, and he'd still been alive after the second, still trying to spit at us with a half-formed proboscis jutting from his throat. The captain had considered quarantining the hold, but if the infection had spread there was no point. There were 214 people down there, packed tight as rats. It was a miracle they weren't already dead of mundane fever. It spread fast. Europe was gone, and so was most of the States. Maybe it spread slower in the cold. That was all we knew. Harry and Walt grabbed the wrapped corpse and slid it over the back railing with only a cursory attempt at dignity, grunting at the heft of the weights they had tied to the body. Partly for decency. Partly because they worried that the corpse would come back somehow. It was, of course, inconceivable, but that word didn't hold the same weight it once had. It smacked against a lump of ice and then vanished into the dark blue water. For a moment, I thought that the body spasmed as it sank. But I couldn't be sure and forced myself to dismiss the idea. The thin trail of bubbles were quickly lost in the waves, and Mikhail was finally gone. The captain snapped his cap back on and started towards the prow, gesturing for the crew to disperse. There was nothing more to be said. As the sun sank into the sea like a white paper lantern falling into the deep, I caught the captain having hushed conversation with the ship's doctor, Aronson. I didn't hear what they said, but even in the Arctic quarter light, I could see the strain on the captain's face. The tight-lipped mouth of someone watching a friend walk death row, drawn tight in the knowledge that, however slowly they walked, the end result is the same. Aronson, her expression was clear enough. Fear, guilt, and acceptance. The face of an unwilling executioner. They stood in silence. Then, she walked off without a word. Made her way below deck. Something was clenched in her fist. Something small. I couldn't tell what it was. A little over an hour later, and the captain called us together on the prow. We stood, muttering fervently to one another, as we waited for him to speak. But he just stood, with his back to us, watching as the waves became clogged with ice ahead of us. Eventually, over the low susurrations of the wind and the creaking of the rigging, he spoke. "They're infected, all of them." The smoke from the funnel breathed downwind like black down, like crow feathers, like an omen of something already past. "According to Dr. Aronson, at worst, they have a day left, at best two. It's best to start preparing ourselves for being the last people on the ship." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Walt take a tentative half-step forward. I could tell he didn't want to speak, but knew that he had to. "Is there nothing we can do?" he said, forcing the words out past a barrier. "Ending them quickly." "Not enough ammunition," the captain replied bluntly. "And even if we did, we can't get into the hold without risking infection ourselves. As for mercy, Aronson is tending to them, making sure their passage is as easy as it can be. She reckons that she can He cut off abruptly, squeezing his eyes shut, forcing them open again. "Hold on for long enough to see most of them out. And as for the walking cysts of nature that are killing them, we will starve them out. She brought up enough food to last us for a few weeks and has locked the storeroom. We'll bar the door, but I doubt that they'll even try it." He straightened, looked us each at a point just below our eyes. "We'll be sleeping in the cold for a while, but we'll get through this." We were silent. There was much, too much to say, but it had built up, and built up, until it formed a barrier that none of us dared to breach. He was wrong. They scratched at the door all the way through the first night, gargling chitinously, while the screams and fervid moans of those still turning leached into the wood like a bloodstain, staining this ship white with pain. People were wrong about white. It isn't the color of innocence or purity. It's the color of blindness, of fever, of hate from things that have never known a thought. It's the color of burning without fire, the color of things too dead to rot. The next day, we were woken with a gunshot, and Maxwell was gone. The captain said that he'd had a fever, that he'd asked for mercy, and then fallen into the sea. And true, his body floated in our wake for some time. A dark iceberg on a darker sea. But the bent railing and the captain's panting told a different story. That night, we ate in the cold and listened as the scratching at the door was replaced by rhythmic thumping. The next morning, Harry and Sam woke with a fever. The captain convinced Harry to go quietly, but Sam would not stop screaming. I never touched the body. It's just the cold, you bastard. You've made us sleep in this for 2 nights straight. I can't feel me fucking feet. The captain dragged him overboard himself, heaving and wheezing, though he tried to hide it. It looked like he was coming down with something. There was a string of gunshots while we slept. When I awoke, it was just me, Philip, and the captain. We cannot let those inhuman shits win, he wheezed. He had the only gun. I held in a cough. Soon it was just me and the captain, alone on our white ship. That night, I went down to the door. They'd stopped banging, I don't know how long ago. It was hard to get the boards off, and harder again to force the lock with the crowbar, but I got it open. Stumbling, wheezing, numb, and buzzing with fever, I cut my arm on a strained nail stepping through, and felt it grate against something smooth and half-formed beneath my skin. They weren't dead, but they were close. The cold, the hunger, breathless in clothes they did not understand but were too afraid to remove. A few slumped before me. Those who did not have the strength to crawl down to the warmth of the many in the hold. It was here that I got my first look at the thing under my skin. There was something in the wide caprices of their heads, the alien mouth parts twitching feebly, and the proboscis handing limp. That was not human, but deeply melancholy. It was their eyes, most of all, that struck me. Not compound eyes, but deep brown eyes with narrow pupils that looked up at me, too sick to do anything else. I went further down. The hold. There was order here. Here they had a few dregs of life left. One pulled themselves to their feet and dragged themselves towards me. I saw that they were lame in one foot, a bandage wrapped around their ankle. I don't know what they wanted from me. I don't think they knew either. They hadn't touched their dead, at least not to eat them. They had precious little in the way of space, but they were laid out, one by one, with their eyes covered. I stood in the center, surrounded by the dying. I knew the captain had come down by the way their quiet chittering stopped, and by the sound of the revolver clicking. I turned around. The gun wasn't aimed at me. I'll do it, he panted, the half-filled sack of blasting powder shifting in his grip, with a sound like sand. I'll take this ship down, kill all these sick fucks. They took... He coughed, wretchedly. Fucking children, he screamed. All of them came into this fucking world through... He panted, unable to find a word vitriolic enough to describe his hatred, unable to even voice it. Instead, he let out a whistling moan, furious, animalistic, almost insectile. His revolver shook, but I did not feel fear, not for myself at least. Perhaps it was the fever, rotting my mind from within, or perhaps I was just seeing without the white. They're alive, I said. They could keep living, if we let them. They'll not like us, he said, almost whispering. They don't feel joy, or love, or hate.
They can't feel a mother's love. They don't know what it is to have a family, to have a nation to die for. They're animals. Vicious, horrific animals. God's light was never meant to shine on them. He made us in his image, not in the image of a bug, so they will die like bugs.
He hefted the bag again, jammed the pistol into it with such force that it might have gone off from that alone. But it didn't. His infection must have progressed faster than mine, or else he simply had it for longer. I suppose it didn't really matter, if he hit it or not. In the end, it just came down to a matter of strength. And there was something in him, maybe some frantic hope, that I would see things his way. That all we had was fever. That we could go back up to the deck, see the sky, shut the door, and starve out our hold of devils. So he took a bullet. In my sleep-deprived, feverish state, I can't say how the gun went off. But by then, the end was the means. I didn't have the strength to attempt a justification. I brought them food, the things, the people, who had unwillingly, perhaps even unwittingly, brought a tortured, visceral, bloody end to every human life on the ship, everywhere. They thanked me. Not in words, they didn't have language, not yet. They were children. And I was their bizarre shepherd. I wondered how they viewed me. A cocoon waiting to spring into life? A fellow being dying unwillingly for the birth of another, one like them. What was I worth to them? Something so different, the last of the old cruel world, full of the simple justice of hunger and the locked door and punctuated by gunshots. What was humanity to them? Just a disease of the flesh? A world ravaged by disease to the point where humanity is not left. Well, I guess that means that the world doesn't necessarily ravage just humanity. Up next, we have the interview with Vishardrsh. All right, and the following is the interview with Vishardrsh, or Vishardrsh, as I believe it's being called, because sadly we were not able to get him into call. I broke my hand, and then a number of other things happened, and we decided, you know what, probably better to just do a by text interview. So I'll be reading out his part in this voice, and reading out my own part in this voice. So, without further ado, let's begin. The only question I'm miffed for not having you in call for: how does one pronounce Vishardrsh? Also, why Vishardrsh? Unfortunately, the answer to this is stupid. Really stupid. I came up with the username while building a Magic the Gathering deck on my bedroom floor at age 14, before I had any presence on the internet at all. And then I just kept using it for usernames, because, reliably, nobody would use it. It's basically just a mangled pronunciation of wizards. I think I may have stolen it from a Terry Pratchett book and forgotten I did. I kept it because I knew my IRL friends hated it, and I thought having such an apparently viscerally unpleasant to pronounce username was funny. I'm considering the switch to Vizards, which is an actual word, by chance. A vizard is a mask worn by high-class women in Renaissance Europe to keep the sun off their face and thus keep it pale, which looks as creepy as it sounds. Some didn't even have mouth holes and required the mask to be held in place with the teeth, preventing the wearer from speaking. They also bear a striking resemblance to masks from Hollow Knight. I'm not sure if having a username so inherently connected to problematic ideas about class, race, and gender is a good idea, though. I just think they look creepy, and masks are somewhat an obsession of mine. Ironically, I stressed for a few weeks over my Wanderer's Library username before I joined, but couldn't come up with anything and decided I was overthinking it, so I went with that. Well, and to pronounce it, just pronounce wizards really, really badly. And then for the next question, I haven't read this specific piece of yours for the video. I just spent a lot of time while my arm was mending trying to find this. Metal Gear Rising. Phyrexians, Jetstream San versus Elsh Norm. Why? Memes. The DNA of the soul. I thought I'd mentioned this as a joke in my suggestion list, but I didn't. What caused you to seek out my magnum opus? Was it the fact that I have a link to it in my bio? Because that would do it. And I'm going to interject here to say, no, it was not. He had a mood about it, and I didn't realize he had a link in his bio. I spent multiple hours finding it. I will put a link in the description if any of you end up wanting to read it. Okay, back to the actual answer. To condense, MTG releases the March of the Machine block. New Phyrexia takes over the multiverse. Praetor, Elsh Norm at the helm. So far so good. Long-standing characters are being killed off. Everyone is Phyrexian. Thalia is riding the Gitrog monster. Very old canon is being returned to. I am happy. Then they release the magic story for the final set of the 3-part block, and it sucks. It's in the future tense. Norn is stupid. Characters Hasbro somehow managed to make me care about are unbearable. I can't even laugh at Jace. I look over at the Jace Beleren Funko Pop my aunt bought me years ago sitting on my shelf. He appears to be laughing at me, in a plastic, dead-eyed, consumerist way. I have been played the fool. So, I roll up my sleeves and start shitposting. First, the opening part of the story, a fatberg of exposition, bizarre prose choices, and dropped plot threads. I rewrite it. It's fun, and I keep all the events in the same order for ease. As a little Easter egg, I change Norn's vision of Elspeth Tyren, I believe that's pronounced, to a vision of Jetstream San as an in-joke, because nobody outside my friend group will read it. Funny. MGRR character in MTG. Lol. But then the unthinkable. A high-frequency blade flashes, sparks and chitin fly. The only thing I know for real blasts in my head even louder than normal. Elish Norn screams in rage and fear and spits a wad of black phlegm from between her pointed teeth. Jetstream Sam's blade slices through her arm and up through her visor, and the Praetor understands mortality. I have an idea. A very bad idea. I'm going to write crossover fanfiction. I'm going to treat it seriously. And it is going to kick the shit out of Norn's canon to death. And I begin. We all need stupid things in our lives. This is mine. Part 2 has Sam team up with Walter White to defeat El Macho from Despicable Me 2. I haven't actually replied to him in that, so I'm doing it in this video. God damn it. It all makes so much sense. Okay. Next question. All the dust. By the end of the 4th paragraph, I started imagining a faint drumming that got louder and faster as I read through it. The second to last felt like the final drumbeat had evolved into the explosion. And then it all starts again. I could imagine the beat beginning again. I don't know what you did for my mind to work in such a way with the story, but I applaud you for it. Where did you get the idea for this story from, and do you see this world as a repeating cycle? Firstly, Thaumcraft 6, a Minecraft mod. No, I have never played with the mod. All I knew was it had magic gauntlets, and that it was cool as shit and I wanted them. Okay, there are other inspirations. Firstly, I want to make it clear that this isn't a world. A lot of people seem to think it is, and that there's greater context here I'm not letting on about. There isn't, and honestly, I was making up any world-building details on the fly, which is just how I world build in general. I think minute would be thematic here. I will make some up. Then I do. The first draft of Dust had most of the principal ideas set down pretty well. I can literally check. I back up stuff obsessively. The farm, the ector tank, I called it a Viz tank initially because that's what it's called in Thaumcraft 6, lol. Even a god. However, initially, it was just a god dying the same as everyone else, and not god being exploited for magic life force energy until reality collapsed. One of my first ideas was that a giant interstellar creature was sucking the life force from the planet, and that the world would be expanded upon with more entries, because I love writing series. I've started on my second for the library, well. But then finding a random god dying morphed, with most of the same prose, all the descriptions of the build-up of Hector were repurposed from the original draft to be in the underground facility, into a story about capitalism and consumerism and environmental exploitation literally ending reality irreparably. I don't often start my stories with a certain theme in mind, but by the end I always try to have one, which may not be the best way of approaching it, but it's what I do. In this case, I think that it showcases how this can lead to a wonky theme. There's a kind of hope. Even though everything is dead, and that's not how environmental destruction works in the real world, I suppose dust functions as a kind of parody of the idea of going to Mars, or some other planet, and starting over, because almost everything is already dead, and not even God gets to see the results of her new reality. Not for us, not for anyone, maybe. Maybe the new reality is just dead rocks. It's like, yeah, here's your second chance. It sucks. Fix the world you're in instead. As for the drumming effect thing, rhythm is something I bear in mind, and I do write the final section with a growing rhythm in mind, but I think it would be an exaggeration to say I planned it like that. I've done poetry reading stuff before, and the way my writing sounds audibly is something I sort of bear in mind when I write important prosy bits like that. Well, now I can't get the fox corpses out of my head. How many foxes have you seen as roadkill that you found the emotions to write a poem about it? I remember the first time I met a fox, a living one, because there are always fox corpses, and I say met because I didn't just see it, I met it. There are a few ways humans can interact with animals, but what I did that grey day, all days seem to be grey in London, when the light was low and I was tired from school, was exchange fear with an animal that seemed to tower over me, standing bold as anything on the other side of the road. It was the first move. I waited for it to disappear, filthy and musky, with the threat of something the city hadn't ground down to safe, rubberized playground flooring. For the first time, I understood what it was to not understand. Mutual alienation. We were both in a place far removed from what our hindbrains understood, no matter how familiar it became. But there were always more foxes. And I got tired of being scared and not looking at those bodies, as if I were ashamed or afraid. Nobody liked that the foxes were dead, but nobody seemed sorry either. I do not pretend that the foxes care or understand that I'm sorry, but I am. There are little patches of the city that slink and flaunt and disregard and make the city no longer belong to us. They're not our myth, or a prey, or a pest, or our prey, or our commodity. It's hard not to wish to see ourselves in them. Londoner. As someone who lived out in the countryside of England as a child, I still have vague memories of it. And between the big city fantasy, I can still remember the feeling of gunk from visiting it that you masterfully bring forth. Was there a particular event that caused you to write a poem about being a Londoner? Have you ever been on the tube and heard that overwhelming sound of scraping metal? Like 1,000 years of construction are collapsing on you simultaneously, and watched an entire carriage of people packed into each other's armpits just not respond? That, right there, is the London spirit. Isolation. I used to define being a Londoner by how well you knew the city, by knowing the side entrance to the Natural History Museum, which is about 40 seconds walk from the hour-long queue to the main entrance and is ubiquitously empty, by not taking that god-awful tunnel from the station to the museums like you're on a conveyor belt, and definitely not those who took the car into London and spent far too much on parking. But now, I don't know. That poem was written at 3 a.m. in about one draft, because I needed to. What is a Londoner? I smell piss and petrol, and I'm at home. Next question is about echoes and the desert. This story feels like a damn tidal wave, a slow swell into a crushing break, and what's left being buffeted back and forth in the water before settling. I know you said it wasn't your favorite, but honestly, I don't often get as hyped for the emotions in the pre-reading as I did for this one. What was going through your mind as you planned or wrote this? When I joined the library, there was some newbie who was evidently a bit too young for the site who cold posted the same thing twice. Firstly, titled Desert of Dreams. Then, after the first one got taken down for using a non-Creative Commons image, Desert of Dreams, which got taken down for the same reason. Not that I can criticize them for that, lol. I wrote some absolute shit for, no, I still write some absolute shit, but I read it wasn't very good, and thought, cool idea though. And my brain started wandering around the ideas of strange deserts and desserts. I wrote echoes really quickly. I was definitely supposed to be studying for my A-levels, lol. But the thing that changed the most wasn't the general idea. It was always about a character trying to make peace with the echo of their partner. But with how I dealt with the ending. The original had him torn apart, but I looked back and thought, no, there has to be a way out. So I made a happy ending, of sorts. They're not happy, but they know that there's a sunrise somewhere else. That's something I carried through to all my other writings. The idea that there was to be hope. It's a major theme in my stories. Ocular Haze, which is set in the same canon as Hard Drive and Hardened Mechanisms. Things might be shit, but you have to keep going. There's a sunrise somewhere. The next question is about Hard Drive. One thing I noticed was the mention of anomalies. Is this connected to SCP anomalies or something else? And is there something specific you were pointing towards with the false promise of the ring and the never-ending construction hidden inside never-ending petty conflicts? Kind of. As a new writer, I was pretty sure that writing the SCP universe was what I wanted, albeit without any of the SCP lore. I wanted to create another universe connected to the greater canon of SCP via the library, because I thought that was what everyone wanted to do. Well, so yeah, the very original draft of this was about a twisted version of the Foundation dealing with the sun going poof, complete with weird notations and the first steps of fictional geopolitics and yada yada yada. But then I wrote this instead. What you read is actually an updated version of what I posted. Old world building, I contradicted in later stuff. But the idea is that the protagonist in this has created a social system that is incredibly stable but abjectly miserable. He's given people a safe outlet for violence in each other by deliberately stunting technological development and an internal promise in something better in the ring, which is impossible to get functional. I think, solid base for a dieselpunk dystopia on a frozen planet where everyone has to be cybernetically augmented. This is more retconning, but one theme I tried for in the canon this is set in, Iron Band, is people being forced into situations where all choices they could make are bad. But the canon's main theme is living. No idea how well I pull that off, but I try. As a brief aside, the Society for the Control of the Preternatural is, well, you can work it out. In canon, they're a group that focuses more on leveraging political influence than actually containing anomalies. Individual components of the organization are competent. The overall body is decidedly not. They sell anomalies to buyers as trophies. They may get featured in a future piece, and maybe not even by me. I'd love for other people to contribute to Iron Band. So, there's your foundation. And I'm going to say this right now. I would love to see people expand on this. I know myself, I'm going to check out... I'm going to get it wrong if I don't scroll up Ocular Haze. I know I'm going to read Ocular Haze on my own time in a bit. So, yeah, write more for it. We love it. Quick heads up that the question seems a little bit off because I wrote this all as a bundle of questions and sent it to him at once. But, about Hardened. You mentioned that this is part of a larger canon before. I'm getting techno-punk vibes from it. Would you say that's accurate to the canon as a whole? What exactly is the story about, and does it follow Jarden and Enmiat? Sometimes you just want to write about a mech heist. I had the idea for the tardigrade-shaped mech in my head. You got this. I wanted something fast, intense, and without any real meaning except for a sudden difficult decision at the end. The end might be a bit vague, but the viables are those with viable wombs, an important and high commodity, which a rival city, M2 Rafich, doesn't want delivered. So they hire these criminals to deal with it in a way that hopefully won't get traced back to them. And there's a link in the white text to Ocular Haze, my series in the same canon set a while later. The two characters in the white text are Spittlestring, the one who speaks in italics without capital letters, and Ethenin. I was trying to insinuate that Enmiat is Spittlestring in the past, and the viables he saves come back. I haven't written that part yet, but they're a side character in Ocular Haze Part 8. Jarden? Who knows? I imagine that Enmiat wouldn't want much to do with her after that. Maybe M2 Rafich pays her what she's owed, and she gets her cure. Maybe she rots in the wasteland. I like to think that you could write a story about basically anything, in basically any setting. And Jarden definitely has a lot of baggage to work through. There could be a story there, if someone wanted to write it, but probably not me. Next question is about a disease of the flesh. I know that this was from the Picture Palooza contest, but have you written anything more about the disease, or else what did you draw upon when writing it? Nope, but if you want to know what I drew on for this, oh boy. I Am Legend, District 9, and The Girl with All the Gifts are all very directly borrowed from. The bug thing was borrowed a bit from Charlie Higgins' The Enemy series. The semi-unreliable, uncaring asshole narrator is borrowed from how I read H.P. Lovecraft, especially The Color Out of Space. I'll be honest, my thematic aims for this didn't really land, and that's kind of why I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to create a sympathetic monster that's only monstrous to our somewhat unreliable narrator, in the same way that our society makes monsters out of people with regular ease. But I made them a bit too scary. Well, the bug people are supposed to be strange and blameless, but comparing them to any actual group of people would be, fucking rude. As a result, it's only a story about that idea in abstract. I think the best way to read disease is as a horror story. I just hope that Twitter implodes before I can get cancelled for it. I was really chuffed for my image, though. A very good one with some very interesting actual story behind it. The US Revenue Cutter Bear is a very real ship with a wild story that I was reluctant to step on the toes of. Alright, and then the wrap-up questions. First of all, what does the Wanderer's Library mean to you? I joined to get better at writing and to have a place where people would actually read my stuff. Like, one time in 5 I could get a friend to read something that I wrote, but that wasn't really great, lol. It means a bit more to me now. It took me a year to actually get involved in the community, but there is a nice atmosphere of collaboration, and I can threaten wide swaths of people with violence, if they don't read my writings without fear of repercussions. It's a real safe space for a lot of people, even antisocial nutters like me. Just don't read anything I post on the forums when I joined. My introduction post deserves the incinerator. And next, is there anyone you would like to recommend for a future spotlight? That's a hard question, especially as you've hit on all the well-known authors, and some of the ones I want to recommend don't have a mountain of stuff to read. You might have to do a multi-author episode to pick up some of the smaller authors, lol. And as a heads up, I'm down to doing this, but I'm also down to just read even 1 or 2 works, if that, from an author. I don't mind. But back to the thing. Anyway, in no particular order, for Amina, only 3 articles, but very good. And then something I'm not going to be able to pronounce, because, like him, I am a cringe monolingual. Yes, I copied and pasted that. I am a cringe monolingual. Is a generally great poem that packs a lot of punch. Fuck the police. Mad Gasser Gatton. They have very good pieces about cooking, but not like in Breaking Bad, with food and shit. Shit's wild. I didn't even know that you could make food edible without boiling it. Uncertainty Crossing. Drawing on Wondrous Library? No! Some very creative blends of image and text that seem a bit too high effort for the SCP Wiki's spin-off site. Cadaver Commander. Incredibly talented writer. Also, I accidentally called him cringe on the Discord because I didn't recognize him under his Scarecrow username, and he compared Elsh Norn to a urinal. Carolyn Ivy. That's just poetry. That's just like actual poetry on the SCP Wiki's sister site. May be hard to get a hold of her, but she is the best poet on the site hands down, on God no cap. Sarah Phantom. Incredibly hard themes tackled incredibly well. Akam80, creator of the single most underrated piece on the site. Tizata all the way down. Of course there are others, because everyone who posts on Wanderer's Library deserves a shout out, but these are what I could think of. And while he's not actually here, I'm sure he'll actually listen to this. Thank you very much for the interview. Thank you very much for the pieces. It's been a wonder being able to do this, and yeah, thank you very much. And I guess I'm just going to wrap up on this screen because I can. Good luck out there, everyone. It's been an honor reading for you, and an honor being able to do these author spotlights. Good luck out there, and get yourself something good to drink.